Life begins at conception. But what about birth control pills? What about frozen embryos? How should a Christian think and respond to these on this slice of fresh bread? Welcome to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church, Gainesville, with Pastor Brandon and Pastor Keith. Well, thanks for clicking on Fresh Bread. Fresh Bread, where we're bringing the truth of God's Word to a starving world. Fresh Bread Podcast 54. And today we're going to continue our discussion that we started last podcast. So if you missed last podcast, you don't really have to go back and listen to that one, but you can listen to this one, then go back and listen to that one. We talked about abortion and a specific question that someone had asked us. And again, it was a really tough question, right, Pastor? I'm Pastor Keith. That's Pastor Brandon.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, it's a very difficult question, and it's a matter of conscience for me in terms of even how to answer that question. I think that we have to recognize life is precious, and that, we need to, in terms of understanding, we need to understand life is from conception, and that the difficulty of that question was, the technology that we have to understand, what's going on in a pregnancy early on, and especially a pregnancy that's not where the egg is not properly implanted into the uterus, and there's several different scenarios for that and what happens with that, and so makes a incredible moral dilemma because of the technology that we have to know that there's a great chance of creating problems, even unto death for the mother and for the baby as well, and so it makes a very difficult question in that case. But I think what we definitely want to make sure everybody understands is that we are not for abortion, and that ultimately we see life as starting at conception. And this is one of those situations where what we discussed in the last podcast is definitely the rare situation of, I say rare, but obviously we have a lot of medical folks in our body, and so I don't want to profess to be somebody who understands completely medical situations, but it's definitely exceedingly rare that would happen, and so it would create a potential moral dilemma. And I landed, and I think my conscience is okay with landing here, that there are some situations where a person needs to be fully informed of the truth to make the right decision before the Lord, and that they need to make that decision by faith, and that they need to make that decision with a clear conscience.
And the reason we did this is that we probably could have just extended our last podcast longer and longer, but some things came up that we were thinking about, and so we decided to split these podcasts into two. Still kind of with the abortion being kind of what we're thinking of or talking about, but there's other questions that came up that I had for you that I wanted to run past you, and we didn't want to go too long, so that's why we split this. So I'm going to jump in and just ask you this question. We're talking about life begins at conception. How about birth control, where you are stopping life beginning in the first place? How do we deal with that in a biblical way?
Boy, I've actually that's been an evolution for me in terms of my thinking. I think earlier in my Christian walk, I wouldn't have thought of birth control as a problem in terms of if it's before conception, if it's keeping the sperm and the egg from coming together in whatever way, that as long as it's just in that part of the process, as opposed to after the sperm and the egg the sperm has fertilized the egg. Once that happens, then anything after that is life, and we wouldn't want to mess with it. And I think it would be sinful to mess with it after that, for sure. That's clear cut. When I say I've evolved in my thinking, and this is a tough one because so much has come out about birth control and the adverse effects even on the mother. And because of the system. I mean, they even give birth control to young teenagers to stabilize and bring their period into regularity. And I I don't, at this point in my walk, I don't see that as being what they should be doing. I think it's wrong to do that. I think it's wrong to give birth control to young people like that. And the truth of the matter is that they're doing that. It may be, part of their reasoning may be to bring, to give them regular periods so that they don't have even difficult periods, because of that can happen in some women. And that may be one side of it. And I get it. I understand. But on the other side, because people are so promiscuous at this point, in terms of wanting to have sex with who they want to have sex from a very early ages, you're giving them that quote unquote, that opportunity to do so without the potential of having a baby. And that's selfish. It's wrongheaded. We need to be teaching our children, not to have sex before marriage. I mean, that's the answer. The answer is monogamy. The answer is not having sex before marriage. And we need to be teaching our children, especially in the church. I don't, in terms of, unbelievers and how they live, I think we need to be voting, and that we need to be encouraging our government to do the right thing morally, but especially in the church, we need to be encouraging our young women to, abstain from sex before marriage, to wait until they find the right man, and before they give themselves over that way. And that, this idea that it's, in terms of hard periods and things like that, I do understand it, but I also understand that there are long-term potential issues that could happen in terms of even being able to have children, especially with long-term use of birth control. So I'm not pro birth control at this point. I think that in marriage, there are some people who have the Duggars have had a huge impact in terms of that, the idea of having as many children as the Lord gives you. I don't have a problem. I don't in terms of person in marriage, I think it goes back to a matter of conscience. I think where I'm at today, personally, if I were in that position today, I would be finding other methods of control, whether it's the rhythm method or some other method that would, to make, in terms of reasonable, a reasonable amount of kids that you can take care of. And I'm not necessarily on the road of, let's have 25 kids type of thing. But, if somebody chooses that, that's great. I mean, let's populate the earth, right? But I'm not necessarily on the train of that we should have as many children as possible, humanly possible. But I am on the train of the Lord gives those children. And if I had it to do over again and the Lord gave me 10 children, then that's what it would be. In terms of medical, in terms of the pill itself, I'm personally not for it, but in terms of, it's probably because of the health of the mother and also the health of future children and the ability to have future children. So personally, I wouldn't do it in my walk. That took a while to get to. We've got nowadays, you got what's called the morning after pill,
yes,
which is ultimately basically an abortion pill.
Yeah.
So if the egg and sperm have come together, it causes the body to abort that. And, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, but my understanding is that happens after the fact. And the only reason that would ever be is because you want to abort the baby. And I would see that as abortion. I would see that as killing the child, because again, it comes after conception, which is when I would say biblically life begins.
So biblically, the birth control pills, is that still kind of playing God? Are we still preventing something that could have happened? Or is it's not a person because nothing ever happened?
Well, I think that's the argument, is that it's not a person. And what's the difference between that and, this is the argument. I'm preventing that egg and sperm from coming together and that egg being fertilized. And so the argument would be, what's the difference, right? There's no difference, morally speaking, between the rhythm method versus the pill, if it's before conception. And that's probably where I was at early in my Christian walk. But then the more I realize, the more I know about the pill. Now you're bringing in this issue of long-term issues for the mother. in being on the pill for an extended period of time. And, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but I mean, the birth rates have dropped precipitously. Part of the reason why birth rates are dropping is not only because of women being on the pill and preventing pregnancies, but it's also when they come off the pill and they now want to have a child, that their body doesn't recover from that. That there's adverse effects from being on the pill an extended period of time. And so now they can't have children. They have difficulty having children, and it's as a direct result of being on the pill an extended period of time. And so when they try to, they can't. And so given that, I've become more anti pill.
Oh.
Yeah. And I mean, I think but I think it's interesting because the Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. And I think that, that again, we have this technology that allows us to manipulate the situation. And why are we doing that? And it's out of selfishness. I mean, it's ultimately out of selfishness. And so I'm using a pill, or I'm not using, but if you use the pill, basically it's because you don't want more children, or you don't want any children. And I think that's selfish, and I don't think that's biblical. And so and let me just be clear. I'm mostly talking to the church, right? This is not for, unbelievers. I can't tell, they don't believe the truth anyway, right? I can't apply the truth to them. Obviously the truth is the truth. And yes, I can apply it to them in that sense, and they're going to be accountable for the truth. But it's not my job to shepherd the lost. It's my job to evangelize the lost, but it's not my job to shepherd the lost. So I'm shepherding those who are in the church, and I'm saying that, the pill is problematic, and it goes against God's call for us to be fruitful and multiply. And ultimately, God says, if I do what God says, that's where I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be blessed. Using Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes, blessed. I'm going to be blessed by the Lord if I'm obedient to the Lord. And the Lord commands us to be fruitful and multiply. And therefore I need to do that if I'm capable of doing that. I need to have children. And I know that there's a blessing that comes with having children. It's pleasing to the Lord. And I've done a 180 in that. And I'm saying that ultimately we ought to have as many children as we can. Now, I'm going to say that I'm not saying that we ought to all be Duggars. that it's just free reign and have as many children as humanly possible. I understand being reasonable, and I understand that that economically you may not have the ability to take care of 15 kids, and I get that, and that's a decision you're going to have to make within your own marriage and family in terms of that. But what I'm saying is, generally speaking, you ought to be thinking about having children and understanding that that's where the Lord blesses that. So ultimately what I'm saying is I have no problem with someone's, being on the rhythm method. And I'm not going to tell you that a person's in sin. It probably comes down to in my mind at this point, it comes down to a matter of conscience in terms of the pill. I'm not going to tell somebody that they shouldn't take the pill, but I am going to tell them the truth of the matter is that there are some problems with the pill, and that you're potentially setting yourself up for some problems down the road if you take it.
Yeah. Well, I'm having some flashbacks of sex education class. Very uncomfortable. No, this is it's a very good conversation. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about. It's just, but you did, and like I said, this is, I'll mention this at the beginning. It's maybe a PG-13 adults only podcast, but also frozen embryo. How does that enter into all of this?
Boy, you just really jumped. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about technologies, and we've talked about how we've advanced in technologies and how sometimes that's been good. Sometimes it's not so good. And I think that in terms of what you're talking about is where you take an egg and a sperm, and in the laboratory, you you unite those and fertilize the egg, that and that is, as opposed to fertilizing the egg internally, the egg gets, laboratory, in the laboratory, it's removed, it's united with the sperm, and you create a baby. And generally speaking, it could be the woman's egg and another man's sperm, or the wife's egg and another man's sperm. It could be the other way around, depending on the woman. I mean, my understanding is it could even be another man's sperm and another woman's egg, and that's implanted so that you can go through this pregnancy, the natural process of pregnancy, even though you're unable to. We have all those technologies that can do that. Not all technologies are good, and I would say that this technology is one that's not good. And the reason is because my understanding is, and again, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that they take multiple eggs and they fertilize multiple eggs so that they have extra in case the first, 1, 2, 3 or whatever don't implant properly. And if that happens, they get the opportunity to use another one. And evidently, my understanding again is that every time there's an associated cost. So, maybe it's $10,000. I don't know what the number is, but it's, the first egg costs this much, and, there's an initial cost, and that egg gets implanted, and this is the cost of the process, $20,000 or whatever it is. If that doesn't work, then there's an additional cost to implant another egg. But they do multiple because they don't want, that upfront cost of doing the fertilization. It's probably cheaper just to do 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is. The problem is that, let's say the first or second egg implants and the process works. Well, they have frozen the 5 or 6 that are on the shelf. So what happens is there are potentially multiple embryos that are frozen that never get used. Now, there is the possibility that the couple understands they understand the moral dilemma of having all these frozen embryos on the shelf, and they may have in their mind they're going to implant them all and have multiple children. I'm not saying that they're wrong in that in terms of how they would do that, but for me, I wouldn't want to go down that road. I just don't. I think that it's an ungodly technology, and it's certainly over the line of what we should be doing as people, as humans. Now, embryo adoption, and I've gone through this in my mind and heart, and what that is that you have the original couple who have, that now this woman has had their implant and it's worked and they've had the child, and they don't want the rest of the embryos. So they don't want to go through that process again. They have no need to go through the process again. They have the child or even multiple children they want, but there's these embryos that are left over. What embryo adoption is that they're trying to step into the gap and say, okay, that's already been done. That, the original thing has already been done. These embryos are on the shelf and ultimately they're going to pass on. They're not going to, they're ultimately going to be discarded even. And so why don't we take advantage of the fact that these exist, the technology exists, and let's give these kids a chance at life. Again, I think it's a matter of conscience, right? I think you need to understand the reason why. You need to completely understand the reason why those embryos exist. That ultimately, biblically, I think personally, in my understanding of life and Scripture, I think it's over the line, right? We're interfering too much in the process of life. Having said that, I would also argue that there could be that a couple could say, you know what, we're okay with that. We feel like it's okay to adopt them and give them an opportunity at life. That's the better thing to do. I struggle with it in this sense that ultimately that is life. And ultimately the Lord knows that it's life, even though it's been scientifically brought about, right? Even though it's been manipulated, I still would say that God is the one who gives them life. When that egg and that sperm come together, that God infuses life into that embryo, right? That is a life. And if that life passes away and never is given a further opportunity to live, that baby is in heaven, right? That baby's in heaven. And so, I don't know what, personally, again, I'm trying to be careful because it's a matter of conscience, but personally, I don't see myself going that direction because I already know what, the Lord is, the Lord is good. The Lord's going to care for that baby just as much as he cares for any other baby. I already know that. And I think that there are other ways in order to enjoy a child, right? That if you want children, I can go adopt, right? There's many children in the world that need adoption. And I know it's difficult to adopt, but I mean, I can do that. But I don't, at the same time, if a couple came to me and said, "Hey, we want to go embryo adoption, and we feel like that this is something that the Lord is calling us to," I'm not going to say that they're in sin to do that. I think that I certainly can understand why they would do that, and from a conscience standpoint.
Yes, technology is an amazing thing. How that we're able to do these things now that they couldn't do 20, 30 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where...
As we get older, we have to extend that number. We always say 20, 30 years ago.
40 years ago. No,
sorry.
But yeah, it is true that it is becoming that what they can do was not thought of before.
Yes.
I know I've seen this before, but I'm not sure if it was true or not. It's hard to know what they can really do. But you think they'll ever get to the point where they can take embryos and other things and create life outside of a mother's womb? Are we going to get to that point, and where does that all fit in?
Well, I don't. I mean, again, we probably need to do at the beginning of both of these podcasts, you need to do we're not doctors.
Yeah,
we're not,
this is disclaimer.
This is that
Pastor Brandon is not a professional doctor.
And he's not a scientist, and so there could be situations he doesn't completely understand. But just to make sure people don't, it's gonna, if somebody that's an expert in these fields is probably going to be able to go, yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't even know. Yeah. And I'm fine with that. I mean, I'm fine if that's what they think. But, yes, I mean, I do think that as technology advances, there's going to be more and more potential for doing things that, even genetic manipulation, where, you take the cells. I mean, even now they're able to take the cells of, they love the cells of like the afterbirth, they take those cells because they're so rich and they're able to do things with them. But even to the point of now having some ability to do grow organs and things like that. And I don't know where they are in that process. Some of our listeners may know, and I'm sure we'll get some feedback, but I have no doubt that if God allows that we're on the track of doing some things that it's hard to even imagine even now, if the Lord allows it to continue. But my it's interesting because I think that that's where God is going to say that's enough. I do think it's the genetic, it's when we start messing with genetic stuff and start able to manipulate the genetic code, that's when God is going to say it's enough. And that's too far in terms of judging the human race. And the reason I say that is because I'm convinced that that's what was going on in Genesis 6, is that the angels and men were, I think that's what was happening, is that the genetic code of man was being messed with, and it was threatening the line of the Messiah. Mm-hmm. And so the line of Christ. And so I think there's going to eventually be a point where God says, yeah, that's as far as you're going to go. Now, whether he stops it in the sense of, prior to judgment, he stops it and we can't go any further than he allows, or it comes to a point where that's what the trigger is in terms of his judgment. I don't know, but I would just say that there is going to be a limit. But if it continues on the line it's on, like going in the direction it's going, I think that we're going to see some things that will be absolutely astounding to someone who was born in the 60s and 70s. I mean, I can see people. I mean, at this point, I mean, they're even talking about downloading like your consciousness into robotics and living as a robot and basically a cyborg. That's the sort of stuff that they're starting to talk about. And is it reality yet? I don't think so. But are we on the road to being reality with that? I think that it's a possibility. And so when you ask if we can fertilize an egg and have that egg and sperm come to to be an embryo and a baby and outside of the womb, yeah, I think that that's probably something that could be done. If they're not already doing it, it's probably something that we'll be capable of doing.
Yes, and I agree with what you said about the genetic tampering. It is interesting that Jesus did say, so in the days of Noah, so it will be when the Son of Man comes back. So it's interesting that he had that little tidbit. So it was in the day of Noah, which was Genesis 6, which is what was happening then. It was kind of happening now. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parallels between today and what was happening in the days of Noah. So I think that that's one of them, and definitely, I mean, these technologies have definitely at this point have brought incredible moral dilemmas to Christians, including things like adopting embryos and knowing and understanding life and how it starts and understanding what's going on in the womb well before the baby's born. I mean, those are things that have come up in the past 50, 60, 70 years. That prior to that they had no idea. And so it brings up definitely moral dilemmas. And some of those things come to the point of conscience, in terms of, as a Christian being fully informed of the truth and walking in faith and conscience, which is what we talked about with, the prior conversation last podcast.
Yeah. And like you were saying, there's so many factors that people didn't have to deal with 40 years ago. I said 40 that time. That it is more of a conscious thing. And what we're trying to do here is look at things biblically. How would we look at this through a Bible lens?
Sure.
All this technology, all these things that are coming at us. And it's always the side of life. It's always the side of that it's a human. And let's try to walk on that path, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the best answer I can give you in terms of what's important, what's critical.
So as we look at all these things going on, we talked about abortion in the last podcast, and we're talking about birth control and things like that today. How about as we're going to end this, when we look at what we the technology that we have, when we look at something like abortion, going back to abortion as we wrap this up, rape is the big common denominator where people say, look, a woman should not be forced to carry a pregnancy when she's raped. And that is a really tough,
it is a very
horrible
difficult
thing.
It is very difficult. And again, I'm speaking to people in the church, not that the law doesn't apply. The law absolutely applies to the rest of the world. So I don't, that's between them and the Lord. But certainly for someone in the church, that, God would be, it would be clear that we need to protect that life. Kind of the trite thing that it's not the baby's fault,
right?
But at the same time, it isn't. And I need to, and that baby deserves to be raised by a loving mother and father, because they didn't commit that sin, and I shouldn't hold that sin against them. Would it be easy? No, I'm not. No. I would never. That would be very difficult for me. But I can tell you that my heart is set that I would definitely raise that child, and would treat it as if it was my own, because it would be my own. I think there's even some of the things that, like, in the past, the church has been guilty of shaming, young ladies committed sin and fornication and have been impregnated. What do you do with the babies? I don't think we should be ostracizing to the point of to the point of not welcoming, that child into the world. So as an example, if one of my daughters, had sex outside of marriage and had a child, I'm not gonna, that if my child wanted to keep that baby, my daughter wanted to keep that baby in the family, I'm going to encourage that, right? That would be choice number one. Even if I disagreed with that, what they were doing, I would still want to keep that child. I would want that child to be part of the family, and I would treat that child as my grandchild, and I would encourage my daughter to treat, to be a mother, even if the father's not involved. I think some families have chosen to adopt or to put a baby in that position up for adoption, and I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that's biblically a problem. That they recognize that as a family they're not ready to raise that child. Personally, I couldn't go down that road. Personally, I would never want to give up a child that's part of my family, and I would not want to, as a grandfather, I wouldn't want to think of a child that's my grandson or granddaughter with another family. For me, I would take the baby before I would do that sort of thing. So yeah, those are that's conscience. Many of those things are consciences. Now obviously abortion is not a matter of conscience. Abortion is a law. We don't kill the baby, but in terms of how you handle it, internally with your family, and whether you put it for adoption, whether the grandparents take the baby to raise or that sort of thing, that's a matter of conscience and decision. Walking by faith in those decisions. Trying to keep those relationships, the relationships that you have intact, biblically intact. So, there's forgiveness and that sort of thing. And I'm certainly not at all condoning fornication and adultery. But at the same time, I'm recognizing that in a fallen world, those things happen, even to great families, even to families that are walking according to the Lord, and that stuff happens. And sin is pervasive. But my wife and I always talk, two wrongs don't make a right type of idea. Two sins don't create a good situation. And so I, in those situations like rape, adultery, that sort of thing, you keep the child is my opinion, what my conscience tells me. At the very least, you make sure that child has a good home, and that it's cared for.
Yes, and we hope that, again, this has been beneficial for people listening. It's a serious topic. Again, I feel like I'm back in high school, sex education, very uncomfortable. But it's good
you look uncomfortable a couple of times. A couple of times you've looked really, really uncomfortable.
It's a blunt conversation, but it's something as believers we need to understand biblically where this fits in. So I was going to say one last word that you have on abortion or life. Is any last thing you want to say?
Life is precious. And we need to be, as Christians, we need to recognize God's command to be fruitful and multiply, and how precious life really is. And we need to be those who are on the side of life no matter what. And so, there's some difficult questions that we've tried to tackle in this podcast. But if nothing else, if you heard nothing else, you make sure you understand that life is precious, that we want to give as a fruitful a life as possible, in terms of those who are being born. We don't want to be down that worldly view of children are a problem. Children are not a problem. They're a blessing from the Lord. Families that are blessed with many children, that's a good thing. I would love my house to be full of grandkids. That would warm my heart to know that, because I want to be fruitful. I want to be a man who, when I go to see the Lord, he says, well done, good and faithful servant. And it's not just my theology. It's how I've lived my life and how I've handled my family. So,
yes, on these tough decisions, we let God's word guide us in the Holy Spirit and make wise decisions on that. Yeah, after lots of prayer. So, okay. Well, we hope this was beneficial, and I can start feeling comfortable again now that it's over. So. You've been listening to Fresh Bread, a podcast ministry of Grace Bible Church Gainesville. For more information, go to gracegainesville.org. And thanks for listening.